Welcome to episode 179 of Real Health Radio. You can find the links talked about as part of this episode at the show notes, which is www.7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/179. Real Health Radio is presented by 7 Health. 7 Health works with women who feel obsessed with and defined by their bodies. Using a non-diet, weight-neutral approach that combines science and compassion, we help you transform your physical, mental, and emotional health. We specialize in helping clients overcome disordered eating, regaining their periods, balancing their hormones, and recovering from years of dieting by learning how to listen to their bodies. We're currently taking on new clients. If you're ready to get off the diet roller coaster and heal your relationship with food and body, please get in contact. Head over to www.7-health.com/help. HELP, and there you can learn about how we work with clients and apply for a free initial chat. The address again is www.7-health.com/help, and I'll include that link in the show notes. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. Happy New Year. It feels a little weird saying that considering I'm recording this during December, but at the time that you're going to be listening, it will be the new year. And actually at the time that this is going to be released, I will be sunning myself in Thailand. I'm having a week in Thailand and then nearly 3 weeks in Australia over the January period. So it will be nice after a pretty full-on year to have some time off and to have an extended break. So this week on the podcast, it is my annual favorite books, documentaries, podcasts episode. This is actually my 5th year of doing this. So I'm going to link to all of the previous episodes where I've covered it before, and you can see what I've read over the last half decade and watched, etc. The plan is next year, I want to include the whole of the 7 Health team. So I've taken on 2 new practitioners now. I've got an operations and marketing director. And so I've requested that they start to record everything that they're reading and watching and listening to, etc., so that it won't just be me doing this next year. It'll be a combined effort. And so what I want to do is just go through some of the highlights from each of those various categories. If you do go to the show notes, which is www.7-health.com/179, you can see the full list. So you'll be able to see all the books that I read this year, all the documentaries I've watched, and then I'll link to some of the podcasts. What I'm also going to do this year, which I haven't done before, is just include music. So just me going through what are the bits of music, the albums, the things online, etc., that I've listened to the most this year. It won't be particularly comprehensive, but just to give you a bit of an idea of what I listen to, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 hours a day when I'm working. And with this episode, like I request every year, I would love to hear your feedback, and that can be just posting a comment on Facebook under where this is posted, or on Instagram where this is going to be posted, or just sending an email to info@7-health.com and just letting me know what's been your favorite book, what's been your favorite documentary, etc. I always love receiving those emails, and it's often where I find out about things that I want to check out. So yeah, please give me your feedback. So to start with my books for the year, so I read 23 books this year. And when I say read, there are books that I don't complete. So I'm definitely one of those people who will read what I want to get out of a book. And so some of these will remain unfinished. Some of them I will continue to read. I'm normally reading like 5 or 6 things on the go at any one time. But yeah, 23 was where I started. One thing that I noticed when I went and compiled this list is that I didn't read any fiction this year. And that is something I want to correct next year. I really enjoy reading fiction. It's, I mean, for escapism reasons, but I also think it helps me to be a better writer. But yeah, I just enjoy it. And so it was just a realization that has been missing from this year, and I want to remedy that. So what I want to do is just go through I think there's nine of the list that are standouts, and I'll just explain a little bit of why I like them. So my favorite book for the year was Range by David Epstein. And the kind of subtitle for that is Why Generalists Triumph in a Specialized World. And so what the premise of this book was really looking at the whole 10,000 hours rule. So this was very much popularized by Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers, and the notion that if you want to become an expert at something, you need to put in 10,000 hours, and it's 10,000 hours of really explicit practice. And from this came the idea that if you're going to be the top of your field, you really need to specialize early, and it's so important to just then focus on that one thing and get better at it. And what Range is doing is looking at why that is actually a mistake, and it's actually not borne out in the research. And rather interestingly, Malcolm Gladwell appears on the jacket of the book with a quote, something to the effect of like, it's very enjoyable to read how wrong I was, or something to that effect. And I just found the book really interesting, and I think part of this could be confirmation bias, in that I'm someone who likes to read widely, even though like at the core what I do is nutrition work with people, or helping with body image, or helping with disordered eating, etc. What I read is much more broader than that, and I feel like by reading widely, it then helps me in that skill set. And it was that this book tended to confirm that. So maybe there is some confirmation bias. But he just talks about the power of critical thinking, and why this is such a skill that we're losing, and how helpful it can then be in all facets of life. Just why it's so useful to be studying divergent topics. He talks about when specialization really does help. And so looking at things environments where you know all the rules. So for someone who wants to be a chess grandmaster, within chess, all of the rules are known in advance. And so by starting as early as possible and playing as many games as possible, you get better and better and better at that game. And so there are areas where specialization really does help, but he talks about the fact that in most other areas, he calls them wicked environments, and they're environments that aren't like chess, where you don't get immediate feedback, where you don't know all the rules, where you can start to make intuitions, and some of those intuitions then turn out to be incorrect. And that's why it can then be so helpful to have critical thinking skills and have this divergent interest areas. And even with a lot of sports where you would think early practice makes the difference. I mean, he compares Tiger Woods, who is just the quintessential person who started at 2 years old. I think it was 2 or 2.5. He was on some TV show because he could drive a ball however many meters or yards or whatever, and just had this just one thing that he's done his whole life. And then compared that to Roger Federer, who, yes, was very much into tennis, but played a whole range of sports all throughout his childhood. And it was only when he was, 13 or 14, or maybe even later than that he was like, cool, I'm going to make tennis my thing. And so, yeah, I just found it a really interesting book. He touches on so many different topics. I liked his writing style. I liked the anecdotes. So yeah, I have mentioned it on a couple of podcasts in passing. I definitely recommend it to many clients. And so yeah, Range by David Epstein was the name of the book. So number 2 was How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. So Michael Pollan, I'd known as a writer for a really long time. He wrote the Omnivore's Dilemma. I'm blanking on all his other books, but yeah, he's written a lot around nutrition, a lot around health. I know for some people they're find his writing problematic in the fact that it's quite classist and elitist, and I definitely can see those faults now that I probably couldn't see before. But I have always enjoyed him as a writer. And How to Change Your Mind was him writing on the topic of psychedelics and the new burgeoning research that is happening in that area. And he'd written a piece, and I think I've made reference to this on the podcast before, called The Trip Treatment. And this was for the New Yorker, I think in like 2010 or 2011. And the treatment was looking at using LSD. It was either LSD or psilocybin, which is the active ingredient in magic mushrooms, with end-stage cancer patients who were dealing with the existential crisis of dying and being very scared of that, and using a session of psychedelics in a controlled environment with a therapist and a guide and all of that to then help with that process. And just as part of the article, writing about how that one session or sometimes two sessions were just groundbreaking for people and just changed their whole outlook on death, and was rated as like some of the most profound events of their life, having this, 8-12 hour trip. And so he became interested in the topic as part of that, and then wrote this book. And the book is looking at the history of psychedelics, so going through the whole sort of 50s and 60s and looking at what was going on in research in that era, and then what was going on in terms of the counterculture, and just that there was this really big amount of research that had happened I think it even might have started in the late 40s, 50s, 60s, before these drugs became illegal, and they had such a profound effect on so many areas in terms of overcoming drug addiction and smoking cessation and many mental health issues. And so looking at that, and then Michael Pollan then talks about his own experiences, and he's, I think, late 50s or early 60s, and he had never had any of these experiences himself before, but as part of writing the book said that he wanted to do that. So he talked about doing LSD, psilocybin, DMT, and I think ayahuasca as part of it. And yeah, it was just really, he's an incredible writer, and as he talks about, it's very hard to actually write about those experiences because often words just aren't sufficient to describe what occurs. And it is an area that I've been following fairly closely, just to see what will happen. And there is a lot of research going on now because and he talks about this in the book, there's just so little in the pipeline in terms of drugs to treat mental health issues. And for a drug to go from start to then being approved and available is an obscene amount of money, but also just takes such a long amount of time. I can't remember if it's a decade, if it's 15 years, but it's a really long time, and there's just nothing else on offer. And so I think because of that, it means the FDA have been more open to starting to look at doing trials and more trials around the world in regards to this. And so, yeah, it's something that I've become fascinated with. I genuinely believe in the next 5 to 10 years that these things will have become legalized, or at least legalized in terms of used in treatment. And one of the areas he talks about is not just using it in a treatment setting for someone who is, say, suffering with depression or is wanting to cease smoking, but for the betterment of healthy people. So people who have no real issues going on, but want to use this kind of an experience to make them a better person, or to get over the everyday neuroses or what it is to be a human. And so I thought he did a really good job. He's been on lots of podcasts talking about it as well. He did Tim Ferriss's podcast, which I thought was a really good interview. So if you don't want to spend the time reading the book, then I would definitely check out that podcast instead. So that's, How to Change Your Mind by Michael Pollan. The next book is Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. And again, I think there's probably potential for confirmation bias as to why I like this, but because I prioritize sleep so much and because I realize within myself how important sleep is. But this is a book, every time I'd go to the airport or I'd be near a train station and I'd go into a W.H. Smith or something, this book would always be on display. And so I think it's done really well in terms of being an international bestseller. And it probably came out a couple of years ago, so I know I'm very slow to the party on this one. But yeah, I've found it just the most fascinating book. And he talks about what are the benefits of sleep, so what's happening and how this impacts on all our various systems, how it impacts on the brain, what's happening when you're in REM sleep, what's happening when you're in non-REM sleep, going through all of the different stages of sleep and how they impact on what's happening in terms of what repair work's going on in each of those different stages, looking at what's going on or what occurs when you're getting insufficient sleep, which is incredibly scary. There's a whole section on how much it just impairs your ability to drive a car when you're sleep deprived, which is really, really sobering. Looking at the various stages of life and how our sleep changes and how our requirements for sleep changes and the amount of REM versus non-REM sleep and how that shifts at different points in life. Looking at the myth that as you get older you need less sleep, so that if you're in your 50s and 60s you need less sleep than when you were younger, and why that is actually a fallacy, even though people can tend to get less sleep at that time. Just makes reference to so many interesting experiments that have been done for us to understand our sleep. There was one early on in the book looking at two guys put themselves into this cave and stayed there in pitch black for, I don't know, some length of time, some very long length of time, whether it be 30 days or 40 days or 60 days. And as part of that, discovered that the body clock that we all have is longer than 24 hours, and that it becomes on or closer to 24 hours because of other things that happen during the daytime, namely getting sunlight and having the sun during the day and then the dark at night. But just looking at if you put someone in total darkness, that they will still typically keep to the rhythm that they normally have, where they're sleeping at the same time and waking up at the same time, except that it starts to extend out a little bit more and is more than 24 hours. So that's just one of the experiments he talks about. But yeah, I found it a really, really interesting book. And what I want to do, one of the early podcasts that I did was on the topic of sleep, of like understanding sleep. And I have been wanting to redo that podcast for quite a while. And I definitely want to go back and do that at some point this year in 2020. And a lot of the majority of the advice that I gave as part of that podcast actually still will stay the same. It's just there's a lot more explanation that can go into where that advice is coming from and why it's so important. So yeah, Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker. The next one after that is Quiet by Susan Cain. And this is probably another one similar to Why We Sleep, where I just kept seeing it in different bookstores whenever I'd be traveling. And I think I actually even bought this 3 years ago, or even more than that. And it had just been one of those ones that had sat on the bookshelf and I just had never got around to reading it. And then for whatever reason, I picked it up and started. And I really, really enjoyed this. I'm definitely someone who is an introvert, and it was really nice to read and have certain things just make more sense because of what she talked about, and flagging up how introversion in lots of ways can be a strength. And it talks about that within our society we have this real extrovert ideal and how that can be a problem. So whether it be the problem of the charismatic leader or the problem of when trying to do collaboration, it's often the extroverts who are the loudest and have more say, even if that's not necessarily the best ideas. It looks at like the biology behind this and why people can be more one way or the other on the introversion extroversion spectrum, and then sort of where these characteristics come from. It looks at different cultures and how introversion and extroversion are valued differently. So obviously in the West, and if we're picking say the US, so Susan Cain is American, so she was writing from that audience, but also making reference to the US and Australia and other the UK and Australia and other places, but how extroversion is much more prized than if you were comparing it to certain other places in Asia, so maybe Japan or Korea, etc., where introversion is much more prized. And then it also looked at just ways that if you are an introvert, how you can better support that. So how you can be better in your love life, or how you can be better as a communicator, or how to raise kids who are introvert children. And yeah, I think it was a really, really well done book. It gave a vocabulary to certain experiences, or just to be able to talk about this properly. So yeah, I would highly recommend it, even if you aren't an introvert. I would think it is a really good book to read, just to if you're an extrovert, to see how it is on the other side. So that's Quiet by Susan Cain. The next is Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. So this is the first on the list of all the books that I've mentioned that I listen to as an audiobook, so listen to on Audible. I don't listen to that many audiobooks. I tend to prefer to actually read. There are exceptions to this in terms of authors, but I find a lot of the time it's just a little bit dull listening to an audiobook, especially in comparison to a podcast where it is more conversational, especially if it is actually a conversation, but even solo podcasts, like I'm trying to do with this, where it feels a little easier, whereas with an audiobook, sometimes it can feel a little monotonous and dry. But with Talking to Strangers, Malcolm Gladwell's been doing revisionist history, his podcast, for the last 4 years, so 4 seasons of that. And because of that, he really understands the power of creating good audio and creating an experience. And so this feels much more like a production. So there's music involved. If he's having an interview with someone that then was used as part of the book, he'll play the audio from the interview. He knows how to read a book, so it's engaging. So I would highly recommend, if you want to check this one out, I would go with the audio book version. And the theme or the premise of the book is just looking at why we often struggle to talk to strangers, but also why we struggle to just understand people and to detect people if they're potentially lying, and just why we can struggle with reading people. And what I like about Gladwell, and this is in all his books, he's definitely been one of my favorite authors since I first read The Tipping Point, which it must be nearly 15 years since I've read that, or 13 years since I've read that. It's a long time ago, but I've read every one of his books, and he's just a really fantastic storyteller. And what he does as part of this book, in terms of that understanding how we are with other people, is re-examining a lot of high-profile cases that we often know about. So Sandra Bland, who was who was not murdered by a police officer, but had an altercation with a police officer and then committed suicide while in jail. Amanda Knox, Bernie Madoff, Brock Turner, Jerry Sandusky, Sylvia Plath, and just using each of them and their stories to look at a different aspect of this. There's this idea of default to truth, so that as humans we will typically are typically trusting and will go with thinking most people are truthful, and that he makes the point that this is a really good thing, even if it means at some point we get screwed over by people like Bernie Madoff. But if we were always on the lookout and always suspicious and never trusting of anyone, that we as a society wouldn't have been able to create the society that we have created. He talks, and this is in the area around Brock Turner and what happened with that rape case. I think it was at Stanford. But just looking at alcohol and how alcohol affects our ability to think, and talks a lot about blackout drunk. And when I'd heard the term blackout drunk before, I would assume if you are blackout drunk, you are just completely passed out, and that was what the term meant. And actually, blackout drunk simply means you've hit a blood alcohol level that it is in fact impacting on regions of the brain that means you are no longer able to form memories. And someone can be standing, they can be talking, you can have no idea that person is in a situation where they are actually blackout drunk and aren't forming memories. And it's a really interesting chapter. He makes reference to Friends, the TV series Friends, and how you can watch the whole thing on mute and you can pretty much work out what's going on because of what's happening on their faces. And that's actually just not the way that most of us are, and how that can be a problem when we're trying to read people, which links into the Amanda Knox case. And so, yeah, I found it a really amazing book. I think he's done a fantastic job in terms of the audio book, but I like the themes and the general thesis of the book. But I know I'm biased because he is, my favorite author. I'm a big fan of his podcast, which I'll mention at some point. But yeah, Talking to Strangers by Malcolm Gladwell. The sixth book is The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis. So I heard Michael Lewis interviewed on Adam Buxton's podcast. I knew his name before because of movies like Moneyball and The Big Short. So he'd originally written books that were then turned into movies, but I'd never read any of his books, and I'd never heard him interviewed before, but I really enjoyed the conversation that he had with Adam Buxton, and at that stage I hadn't heard of the two people he was referring to that he'd wrote the book about. So the book is about the lives and the work of Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, and they did a huge amounts of work in the area of looking at cognitive biases and heuristics and how we handle risk, and they are the people who pretty much started behavioral economics, and they just have incredibly fascinating lives, both growing up in Israel. I think actually maybe one of them moved to Israel during in connection with the Second World War. I'm just blanking on that a little bit now, but yeah, both spent a lot of their lives in Israel, then moved over to the US. Both just outstanding geniuses and just power thinkers in terms of how they are able to see the world and think about the world and to come up with ideas to then be able to test them out and do research, but also very, very human. And so a lot of the book is talking about certain difficulties that they had in terms of their relationship, in terms of Daniel Kahneman struggling a lot with jealousy and depression, and just you seeing this other side to these two brilliant minds. They won the Nobel Prize for economics in 2002, or Danny Kahneman did. Amos Tversky had passed away by then, and you can't get it posthumously. So it was only given to Danny Kahneman. But yeah, Michael Lewis does a really great job talking about just the research as well, and how certain things came to be, and interviewing different people who were part of their life, and having like the story side of things as well as showing what they discovered. And so I have also bought Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, but I just haven't got around to reading that yet. But I think that catalogues most of his work in a lot more detail. So at some point I'll read it. But yeah, I think as humans we have huge amounts of biases, and we make decisions in a completely irrational way. And it was fascinating to read the book and just see how true that is for so many areas. So The Undoing Project by Michael Lewis. The seventh book is When the Body Says No by Gabor Maté. So this had been on my read list for a long time as well. I think must be a couple of years ago I did the podcast on the ACE study, and as part of that I said that I wanted to read When the Body Says No by Gabor, The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, which I did read, and that was on my favorite books from last year list. And then there's, I think it's Waking the Tiger, or something with tiger in the title, with Peter Levine, and that's another one I haven't yet got round to reading. But basically, when the Body Says No is looking at the connection between stress and the various diseases that is connected to this, and not just stress, but trauma, and really goes through a huge amount of the research that has been done in the area of psychoneuroimmunoendocrinology. And it just explains what this is, and explains how the physiology component works that then leads to various diseases. And just basically looking at when you are suppressing trauma, or when you're suppressing emotions, that the end state of this is diseases in various systems. And as part of the book, he tells the stories of lots of people that you don't know, but also uses lots of much more higher profile cases to make his point. And so uses Stephen Hawking, uses Betty Ford and Ronald Reagan. And so, yeah, I found it a really interesting book. Definitely worth a read. I really like Gabor. I think he is a fantastic speaker. I really, anytime I can find him on a podcast, I will check him out. I've recommended his podcast interview with Tim Ferriss to clients a lot. He did a great interview with Rich Roll that I recommend a lot. But yeah, I like this book. So yeah, When the Body Says No by Gabor Maté. The eighth book is called Child of Mine by Ellyn Satter. So Satter was a name that I'd heard for many years, but it just never got a chance to read. And then I read it earlier this year. I think I may have read it after I did a podcast episode with Paige Smathers where we talked a lot about it. And I can't remember if I'd read it by then or I'd read enough around Ellyn Satter to be able to do that interview, but then wanted to read more afterwards. But I really liked the book. I liked the fact that it's looking at how to feed children, but it's not just a nutrition book, or it's the nutrition aspect is only just one component of it. Sara is originally trained as, I think, as a dietitian, and then she went on to be a psychotherapist, but still working in terms of child feeding. But with the book, she's just drawn on all of these different areas. So looking at at attachment theory, looking at eating disorders, looking at child growth, child psychosocial development, and so where a child is and at what age is appropriate to talk about things or do things in certain manners, looking at speech pathology and oral feeding skills, and just all of these different components that have to then come in when you're thinking about child feeding dynamics. And her big thesis, or what she's known most prominently for, is the idea of division of responsibility. And so that being that as the parent or the guardian, whoever is looking after the child, that the job of the parent is to find the food and prepare the food and put the food down in front of the child, and to choose what food is going to be made available. And then it's up to the child to decide what they want to do with that food. So they can eat some of it, they can eat none of it, they can eat just these foods from what is on offer, but when the food is placed on the table, it's at that point that the parent's job or the guardian's job is over in terms of making the child eat. And so this is obviously something I wanted to read because I've now got a small human of my own that I'm raising and feeding on a daily basis, and I just wanted to get a better insight of her thoughts, because she is just the go-to name that is always made reference to around this stuff. And the book, I think it came out in like 1980 or 1982 or something along those lines. So there are certain parts that are dated. So it's quite funny hearing the talk about all the low-fat rhetoric and why that's a problem, and it feels so distant with everyone doing keto these days and everyone promoting a high-fat diet. But despite the age of the book, it still feels very, very relevant. I've actually recommended it a lot to adult clients of mine that I work with who don't have children, just because it's a really useful way to think about, okay, how do I feed myself? So yes, I'm not doing the division responsibility. I've got to do both of these things, but yeah, just how do I think about feeding myself? And when I read through it, I can see that this has probably had an impact on Elise Resch and Evelyn Triboulet when they were writing intuitive eating, because there's a lot of stuff in here that is then relevant in part of intuitive eating and got fostered into that model. And so yeah, I found it a really well done book. It touches on lots of different areas and lots of things that are going to be, if you are an adult and you're reading it from that perspective, there's going to be a lot of it that isn't relevant, that you can skip over. But it's a great book, and it definitely made me also reflect on my upbringing and how I was fed, and how that then feeds into the relationship with food that I have. So yeah, Child of Mine by Ellyn Satter. She's got a number of books, and I think they're all on a similar topic. Just maybe just wanting to write a new book every couple of years, so changing things a little bit. But I would say pretty much any of her books are meant to be good. The final book that I want to mention is The Polyvagal Theory in Therapy by Deb Dana. And so this was recommended to me by a past client. So yeah, during this year, I had a call just with the past client, was just catching up with her, finding out how things have been going. And at the end of the call, she just made reference to this book and just said, "Hey, have you come across Polyvagal Theory? There's this really great book that I've read. I've done some training with Deb Dana, and I really liked it." And it did spark a memory for me that it was something I had come across before. I know as part of the precision nutrition level 2 training I did, there is some bits that they talk about in terms of polyvagal theory, but that had kind of been it. Like I'd known it in passing, I knew the name of it, but I didn't really know very much else apart from that. And then I decided to order the book and to check it out, and then maybe a month or a month and a half later, got in contact with Tracy Brown, who was a guest on the podcast, and we actually ended up spending a lot of the podcast talking about polyvagal theory. And I wanted to have her on the podcast specifically to talk about that because I was just getting into it and finding it really fascinating, and I knew she'd been using it with clients for quite a while, and so I just wanted to get her take and understand how she thinks about it and implements it with clients. So I would say you can definitely listen to that podcast to get a sense of what the book's about. And in a nutshell, polyvagal theory is looking at the autonomic nervous system, so the part of the nervous system that is out of your conscious control, and that there are 3 branches of this, or 3 ways that the nervous system can be going. And this isn't buckets as much as it's a continuum. And so at the top you have being in the safe and social place where you're feeling calm, where you feel just well grounded. You can be rational. You can make decisions, even if things are difficult or it's a challenging situation. You're just able to handle it. Then the next rung down the ladder is fight or flight. And so that's where you're having that stress response and you're feeling unsafe and you're scanning around trying to work out how to get out of that environment, whether that is just running away, whether that is fighting, often proverbially, and then how that being in that state affects the way that you think, the way that you see the world, how you are experiencing things within your body. And then the third rung down is immobilized or shut down or the freeze response. And so this is what happens in the wild in terms of animals like playing dead, and not so much playing dead where it's an intentional thing. It's just like the whole nervous system just shuts them down into that place, with the idea being that you've been, you're a gazelle that's been brought down by a leopard, and then the leopard thinks you are dead because you've frozen, and then it goes off to find its cubs to come back and feast on you, and in the meantime you've got up and run away. And then in more sort of human situations, this can happen in trauma, but it can also happen in being in really intense conversations or environments that for whatever reason it just triggers you to a point where you just freeze up. And so then just understanding, okay, what is it like being in that state? How is your thinking? How is it feeling within your body? And so the book is just explaining all of that, and going into it in a lot more detail, and then looking at all of the various different exercises and things that you can do to actually strengthen your vagal tone so that you can spend more and more of your time in the safe and social place. And when you do dip down into the other places, you have the ability, you have these coping skills to know how to get out of those places so you can return back to that safe and social place. And so, yeah, I've kind of discovered this. This is a book that I've been recommending a lot with clients. It's an area I'm talking a lot to clients about because it just makes so much sense to me. It explains a lot of how clients experience things, and to be able to have that vocabulary to explain it and to understand why it's going on, they're just finding really helpful. And I mean, even just for me personally, this has been a huge bit of self-awareness for me to understand how I react in certain situations. And I know within myself there are certain things that can then just put me into that complete immobilized, shut down place where it just feels like my whole brain has turned to mush, and it's just I can't think, I can't do anything, and I just need to extricate myself from the situation because I've now become incapable of being there. And for a long time when that would happen, I was just like, I have no idea what is going on here, or why I just can't think myself out of this. And so to be able to understand that as part of the book, I've just found, really, really helpful. And I know a lot of clients have too. So that is the final book for the year that I want to mention. It's called The Polyvagal Theory in Therapy by Deb Dana. And so then on to documentaries. So I've watched 16 documentaries in total. And what I want to do is just talk about 5 of them. I haven't, when I was trying to work out, okay, what was my favorite documentary, I haven't had any just absolutely standout, amazing documentaries that just blew me away this year. I've had a lot of things that I enjoyed that I'm gonna talk about, but I know in previous years, like last year, I know I recommended The Work, which was just phenomenal. The year before that, I recommended Tickled, which is still probably one of my favorite documentaries just because it's so bizarre and just well done. And so there was none that were of that ilk, even though they were definitely worth watching, and very enjoyable. So the number one documentary I watched this year was called Bros, When the Screaming Stops. So it was about the boy band Bros, which I really didn't know very much about. I knew of their name in passing. I knew of like the Brossettes, but that was kind of it. And so they were a huge boy band in the late 80s, and I think early 90s. They may have split up in like 91 or 92. But I mean, to give an example of just how big they were, they played Wembley Stadium for 19 shows in a row, which I don't think anyone, like I don't know of any other band that has ever done that. So like huge at the point that they were around, and then they broke up, and it was 2 brothers, Matt and Luke, and they then just went off and did different things. One of them has continued to be a musician and plays in Vegas, and then another has become an actor. And what they were doing was wanting to reform to do some new shows. And why the documentary is so good is it is like watching This Is Spinal Tap, but without them thinking that it is a joke. So people who are like just deadly serious but don't understand how funny it is what they are saying. And I remember there's a documentary called Anvil, which is about a heavy metal band from the 90s who was just like absolutely massive, and it's got all these interviews with like Guns N' Roses and Metallica and all these other metal bands talking about like their favorite band is Anvil, and then no one now knows who they are. And it was again a documentary about them trying to reform and about the struggles that they'd had, which also felt a little bit like This Is Spinal Tap. But yeah, these 2 guys, Matt and Luke, are just living in another world a lot of the time, and just this insight into what it looks like to be just a diva and so detached and just not like when it was released. I think it wasn't meant to be a comedy. It wasn't meant to be like all tongue in cheek or anything along those lines. It was meant to be genuine, and That's just not the way it was received by pretty much everyone who wasn't a Bros fan. So yeah, I knew very little about them as a band, but I was in stitches for watching most of this film. So I would highly recommend it if you're wanting to have a laugh, which is Bros When the Screaming Stops. The second documentary that I want to recommend is called From Shock to Awe. And this is definitely a much more serious documentary. And this nearly went to my number one, but I did really have a soft spot for the Bros documentary. And this links into my comments earlier on in terms of Michael Pollan and the book How to Change Your Mind and psychedelics. So it looks at the lives of two US Army vets who have come back from tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq and are just dealing with severe PTSD. And one of the vets, his wife is also a vet, and she is also suffering with PTSD, and just showing what their life on a daily basis is like, and just how much they're struggling, and how they've tried all these various medications and just nothing has worked for them. And so they go off to a retreat, and it's a retreat. I think it's put on, I don't know, it's actually put on by the army, but it's all army vets that are there. And the retreat is where they're doing ayahuasca ceremonies, so like plant medicine, where they take the ayahuasca and then they will just sit there and go off into their head and deal with a lot of what's gone on. And they have, I think over the course of 2 or 3 days, they have 4 sessions of ayahuasca, and you just see how transformative it is for these guys. And guys, they're sort of just incapacitated and unable to live their life. And by having this experience, it just transformed them. And then the vet whose wife was also a vet, she doesn't want to do ayahuasca because with it you can end up throwing up, and she has an extreme aversion to being sick. And so does MDMA assisted therapy. So that's where you take MDMA and then just have a therapy session during that. So whereas ayahuasca, you have it, and it's then you just go in on yourself, and everything happens within your own head. With MDMA assisted therapy, it's very much like a therapy session, and she has the therapy session, and it's wonderful and very transformative for her. And look, I'm always aware with documentaries that there is an agenda, and that there is a bias, and that there is a story that someone is trying to tell you. So the same as there has been so many different food documentaries on Netflix trying to tell you why you should be paleo or vegan or whatever it may be, and there's a lot of skepticism around the truths that they're purporting as being factual as part of that. And so I'm definitely aware that is the case and can be the case within a documentary of this nature. And with that said, it was fairly astonishing to see the results that the guys and the lady experienced as part of this. There was a documentary that I also watched called Trip of Compassion, which is an Israeli documentary looking at the research that they'd done around MDMA assisted therapy and some of the trials that they'd done with that, and with the trials they videotaped a number of the therapy sessions, and so they turned some of those into a documentary, and that was also really worth watching. It wasn't as interesting as a documentary as From Shock to Awe was, but they're both great, and if you're interested in that area of research, then it would be worth checking out. The third documentary was called White Right. And I first heard about this on Sam Harris's podcast. I think at that stage it was still called Waking Up, but it's since changed to Making Sense. And it was an interview he did with Dia Khan, and Dia Khan is a Norwegian British Muslim, and she is the documentarian. She's the one that made this film, and as part of the interview that she did, she was talking about White Right and also one of her other documentaries, which is called Jihad. And basically, White Right is her as a Muslim traveling to the US to meet up with neo-Nazis and white supremacist leaders and the sort of foot soldiers that are a part of a lot of these groups, and just talking to these people. And she has just the most incredible soft skills, and to be able to be with people and to challenge ideas, but to see the humanity in the person who is having these ideas and often very heinous and horrible ideas. And she is the personification of everything that they hate. But she is gracious and she spends time with these people, and it's really interesting to see what happens. And so for the people who are at the top of these kinds of movements, so the Richard Spencers and the Jared Taylors, she makes very little ground with them and doesn't do anything to move their views. But with the people who are further down, who are more of the foot soldiers, she makes some really big changes, and you just see how there's just this sense of community and this sense of alienation that these people have. And by joining up in these groups where these ideas then just almost come along for the ride, gives them that sense of community and gets rid of the alienation. And it's then by spending time with her, and she will spend, I think there were times where she was spending days and days with these people. And this is the kind of person that they have been told that they need to despise and should hate, in which they've typically never spent any time with. And by her just being so generous and kind to them while still pushing back on their ideas, they start to change them. And so people who are strident, anti-Semites, who are strident neo-Nazis, then start to change their views. And there's I can't remember if this is the postscript in the actual film or the documentary, or this was talked about on the Sam Harris podcast, talking about them coming out of the organization that they were affiliated with, or actually going and having a meal with a Jewish person for which they had joked that they would never do under any circumstances. So I found it such an interesting film, and there are many ways to go about dealing with a problem, and not always are going to help with every situation. But it was nice to see someone who, and again, she's got the patience of a saint and has a real skill at doing this. But to be able to show that when you can show someone humanity and when you can show someone compassion, even in the face of some pretty terrible ideas, that can actually lead to changes. White, it's just called White Right, by Dia Khan. The fourth documentary was called Won't You Be My Neighbor? And this is about the life of Fred Rogers. And this had been on my Amazon, it had been on my watch list for a really long time. I think I'd heard about it maybe a year ago or 18 months ago, and then I just couldn't find it online to watch. I could find it on Amazon Prime US, but not UK. But then I checked more recently, and it was on there, so I decided to watch it. And so, yeah, about the life of Fred Rogers and the iconic TV show that he hosted called Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And this was, I didn't grow up in the US. I didn't know of this show. But it was just a really beautiful story. He seemed like just the most genuine, lovely guy. And yeah, I mean, someone who is very much needed today. And his show was aimed at children and at young children, but would really talk about difficult issues. And so I think when there was a time where there was a big furor about blacks being in white swimming pools and that there should be segregation, and then he kind of brought that into the program. I know there was when September 11 happened, and I think by this stage the show was off the air, but he came back and did another show about that, explaining September 11 to kids. He did a whole series of shows where it was all on like different, more difficult topics. So like had a whole week on like what happens when a parent dies, and just topics that are so heavy, and yet it's done in this beautiful way that is then being able to be watched by someone who is 5 and 7 and 8 and 10, and then obviously adults are able to watch it as well. And it made me want to just try and find his show on YouTube. And at the point at which Ramsey will start watching TV, having that to be able to show him, because there was just this gentleness to him and to the show. And it was also nice to see like a different other side to him as well. Like he talked a lot about his own self-doubts and his own struggles and struggles with depression and why he found it so much easier working with children and working with puppets, and because he could say the things that he couldn't say when he didn't have the puppet on his hand. And so many of the documentaries that I watch are really quite heavy, less so this year, but yeah, I would be always finding just really dark things to watch. And so to watch this, I kind of finished it and I just felt so uplifted. It was just very hopeful and sweet and put a smile on my face, but without it being that sort of over-the-top, saccharine, just horribleness in terms of being too sweet. It was just, they got the tone completely right. And I think I saw something recently that they're now making like a biopic film of his life with Tom Hanks playing him. So yeah, if you don't get around to watching the documentary at some point, you'll probably see the Tom Hanks film. But if you do want to watch it, and I do highly recommend it, I think it was fantastic. It's called Won't You Be My Neighbor? And then the final documentary I want to mention is called Behind the Curve. And so this was a documentary all about flat earthers and the flat earth movement. And I went into this just because I've heard about flat earthers for quite a while now, and I was just fascinated with how do you have that belief, and what are the beliefs? Like, okay, if you don't think the earth is a globe, what do you think it is? How like what is the moon? What happened? Like, if it's meant to be flat, are you going to run into a wall? Like, how does this all work? So I was wanting to watch it from that perspective, to just be aware of, okay, what are the moving parts as part of this belief, and then how does someone come to that belief? And it was a really well done documentary, in that it would be very easy for something like this to just come across as completely mocking of people who are flat earthers. And actually the tone that they took with it was very different to that. It was just much more endearing. And it was a lot of the people who are in that movement are come across as very genuinely nice people. Like the main guy whose name I'm blanking on came across really well. Like if I was to sit down and have a beer with him, I would love to do that. He was really charming and sweet and very open to other people, and it was just, I mean, one of the big things I took from it was, and this is something I've thought about a lot before, but just how much meta beliefs then have this trickle down effect on others. So with the people who were in the flat earth movement, there was this meta belief around suspicion of the government, and that the government shouldn't be trusted, and that they've always been doing these things. And the people who were believing in flat earth, it's most of them, that was not the only conspiracy they believed in. Like it was that, and then this long list of other things. And even the main protagonist, he was talking about all of his various conspiracies as he went through, and then finally got into believing in the idea of the Earth is flat. And so it was interesting from that perspective. It was also interesting from the perspective of how people then prove their beliefs, or how they're able to have cognitive biases or cognitive dissonance. So these people were putting in a huge amount of effort to try and scientifically prove what they was saying was correct. So someone had spent $50,000 or $70,000 on this contraption to work something out, and then when they did it, it proved that the Earth wasn't flat. And so they were like, oh, okay, there must be some other reason that we've missed with this. So they were then trying to put this thing into a box or do something else with it. We're just going to these huge extents in terms of money and time to try and prove what they believe to be true. And when those things didn't turn out to support their idea, just watching how they were able to discard that, or say, oh, okay, that's obviously wrong for X, Y, and Z reason. It was interesting to see the way that people can explain it away. But again, in the same way as I talked about with white right, is just how much these people were searching for community. And when they were able to find other people and they were able to go to conferences and meet up, just how important that was, and how much that gave to them. And they were feeling like they found their tribe. And I went in with very different expectations as to what I got out of the documentary. And as I said, there wasn't a real mocking tone. It was very endearing. And even though I don't believe that the Earth is flat, I came away less judgmental of these people, and just getting a bit more of a sense of how someone could come to a belief of that nature, as ludicrous as that may sound. That's called Behind the Curve. So now I want to just run through a handful of different podcasts that I've listened to, and this is going to be with a lot less detail than on what I've done with the books and the documentaries, just partly because a lot of these I've forgotten about. I've been listening to podcasts all year, and so one podcast kind of blends into another. So I'm going to just name a handful of podcasts that I listen to in terms of these are the things I listen to on a really regular basis, and then just some other ones where they're individual episodes. So the podcast that I listen to the most of anything is Sam Harris's Making Sense podcast. It used to be called Waking Up, and that I will listen to pretty much as soon as it comes out. I really like Sam Harris as an interviewer. I don't agree with everything he says, but he speaks a lot of sense. What I do really like and value about him is he is someone who isn't afraid of having a difficult conversation. He's not afraid of disagreement and wants to have difficult conversations in public and say why he thinks something is wrong and be happy to be challenged on his own ideas. And so I find that really enjoyable to listen to. If I'm trying to remember some of the episodes that I've liked this year, one was called Understanding Humans in the Wild, which he interviewed Adam Grant. So Adam Grant's like a workplace, just like studies workplaces and human relations, and it was just a really interesting conversation. There was one called Rise and Fall, which he did with Jared Diamond. So Jared Diamond is the author of Guns, Germs and Steel, which I thought was a fantastic book. He's done a number of amazing books, but that's the only one that I've read. And he is just an incredible thinker and incredibly smart. And I know the idea or concept of a polymath gets thrown around a little bit more these days than it probably should, but he is someone who is really fits that description. And then he had an interview with Annika Harris, which is his wife, and his wife is also supremely intelligent, and she has written a book called Conscious, which is all about understanding consciousness. And it was a short conversation. I wish they'd probably gone into more detail, but it was useful to hear. And that they would be some of the episodes I would think to start with. But yeah, I think I've listened to every episode that he's done, and I really enjoy the podcast. The next one is Revisionist History. So this is Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, who I made reference to earlier, like one of my favorite authors. I've listened to this since day one. He does a season every year. Every season is 10 episodes, and so there's 10 weeks of joy for me, and then it just drops away again. And yeah, this season he did like 3 episodes looking at like the Jesuits and the Jesuit philosophy, but then understanding that in the real world, which I found fascinating. I'm an atheist, but I went to a Jesuit school, and I didn't know a lot about the stuff that he makes reference to in the podcast. So I thought that was great. There was an episode called The Obscure Virus Club, which is looking at AIDS and HIV and our discovery of how that worked in terms of the virus. And that was a really fascinating episode. But each of the episodes are only, half an hour, 40 minutes, and he just is a fantastic storyteller and does really well with the production value on the podcast and making it really interesting. So I would say just do the whole lot. But the Obscure Virus Club was one of the standouts. Against the Rules was a new podcast for me this year, and this was by Michael Lewis. So I mentioned from the Undoing Project, and Malcolm Gladwell has set up his own podcasting company called Pushkin Industries, and he's just putting out a ton of different podcasts. And Against the Rules by Michael Lewis is one of them. And I think there's 6 or 8 episodes in the season, and yeah, it really, again, he's a fantastic storyteller. The episodes are pretty short, focusing on different things, but all with the common thread of that at the moment within society, the rules feel like they're broken and the world feels like it's stacked in favor of the wrong people. And he's just exploring that as a topic. So yeah, I don't have a particular episode from that one. I would say just start from the beginning and make your way through, because it's a really short series. Spectacular Failures is another one, and I haven't listened to all of these, but I think the production value and the amount of information and content per episode is really interesting. And so I listened to one on Toys R Us. So it's looking at basically how certain companies have failed and failed spectacularly, as the name would suggest. So yeah, looking at Toys R Us, and then there was another one on Trump's casinos in Atlantic City. So yeah, both of those were worth listening to. In terms of the Pushkin Industries and Malcolm Gladwell's podcasts, he's got another one, and he co-hosts this, or hosts it with a number of different people, and it's called Broken Records, and it's interviewing different people within the music industry. And he did a recent one with Flea from the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and I've never really been a huge Red Hot Chili Peppers fan. I've listened to their music over the years. I obviously know who they are, but I found it a really interesting interview. Flea is comes across as a really great human being. He's had just the most bizarre of upbringings. And I listened to it, and it's amazing. He came out the way that he did, and he's had his own troubles with addiction and other issues, but is come good, and it's kind of amazing he's been as unscathed as he has given his upbringing. And so yeah, it was just great to hear about his life and just a different time. So he grew up in Hollywood in the 70s, and so just talking a lot about that and what that was like. And he was promoting his memoir. I think it's called something like Acid for the Children, and the memoir is from as young as you can remember all the way up to just when the Chili Peppers either signed their first album or released the first album or something like that. I haven't read the book, but it definitely made me want to read the book. And it was a live interview with Malcolm Gladwell, and he was very very high praise for the book, and not just in terms of what he covers, but in terms of the prose and how skillful Flea is as a writer. And yeah, I think part of my interest with Flea as well is I'm a big, as I'm going to talk about in a second, I'm a huge Radiohead fan and a big Tom York fan, and Tom York and Flea have done music together as part of Atoms for Peace. And so I think there was part of that interest, which is why I checked out that episode. But yeah, I would recommend it. In terms of nutrition or health stuff, I don't listen to a huge amount. I listen to enough so that I can find guests, but I spend my life in this space. And so for me, a lot of the time, well, pretty much all the time when I'm listening to a podcast, it's for entertainment purposes or to just understand more about the world. But the Cut Through Nutrition podcast I really enjoyed, and again it was a pretty short one in terms of the first season is 6 episodes or 8 episodes or something along those lines. Alan Flanagan, who I recently had on the podcast, he's one of the hosts of that show, and yeah, I just think they do a really good job talking about the idea, or not the idea, they're talking about the area of research and nutritional research. So that is one I would recommend. Edward Norton has a new film coming out called Motherless Brooklyn that I haven't seen. I definitely want to see it. It's getting really good reviews, and I'm a big fan of Edward Norton. and he's been doing a lot of interviews as part of the press for it, and he's just such a great interviewee. He's more of a slow speaker and a thinker, but his breadth of knowledge in terms of film and music and history and just a supremely intelligent and thoughtful person. And so I remember I first listened to him interviewed on Tim Ferriss's podcast like years ago, like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. It was one of the first podcasts I actually really listened to, and was just when I was still getting into podcasts. And then as part of this film, Tim Ferriss has re-interviewed him, and it was an amazing conversation that I really enjoyed. And then I saw he was interviewed by Mark Maron as part of his WTF podcast, and I listened to that episode, and they were two very different interviews. And even though they're talking about the same film, they just talked about different aspects and talked about different things not related to the film. And yeah, I could definitely listen to Edward Norton talk, because I find him to be someone who just has very well considered things to say about lots of different topics. So I would recommend just trying to find him interviewed somewhere and giving a listen. I like Mark Maron as an interviewer. I have to skip through like the first 10, 15 minutes of the show to actually get to the interview section of the show. There's just so much chat and ads that I don't want to hear. But as an interviewer, I think he's really phenomenal. And he interviewed Brene Brown. And I've listened to lots of interviews with Brene Brown now, and I've listened to her books and TED Talks and all of that. So I'm pretty aware of her message, and I've heard a lot of the same stories again and again. But he does a really good job, and even though there was some overlap with stuff I'd heard before, he just is great at asking fantastic questions, great at putting himself into the conversation and talking about his own experiences, especially experiences around shame and dealing with his own internal struggles as someone who's a recovering addict. And so, yeah, I thought that was one of the better interviews I've heard this year. So I would say check that out if you can. Yeah, Mark Maron's WTF and with Brene Brown. And so finally, the thing that I want to mention is just music that I've been listening to a lot of this year. And as I said at the start, this is the first time I've done this, and I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail because there's just so much stuff. I listen a lot to Spotify in terms of like the weekly playlist. So each Monday it serves up another 3.5 hours of music, and I will typically listen to that a lot of times throughout the week, and will save certain bits of that I like into a different folder that's just growing and growing. So that makes up a lot of my listening time. But if I'm going through the year, I think for the start and the halfway through the year, I was very much still enamored with Father John Misty, listening to most of his albums. I think he's got 4 albums, just often on repeat. When I was heading out, it must have been in the February time, heading out to France. I was reading a magazine on the plane, and it had an interview with someone called Billie Eilish, who at that point I had no idea who they were, and I think she's 17. But the thing that grabbed me was at 17, she was like the second or third most downloaded person on the whole of Spotify. And I was like, wow, I've never even heard of her. And so, yeah, when I got back, I had a listen, and I really got into her album, When We Fall Asleep, Where Do We Go? For someone who is so young, she's an incredible lyricist, and just has a real way with not just way with words, but in terms of it being really poignant and being able to kind of talk about her stuff. It's really well produced. So her brother and her are the ones that have produced it. And just really, really well done. And I just, it was the first time I'd listened to music like that in a while, and just the first time I'd been blown away by someone like that in a while. And I think she's going to be huge. And I mean, already is, considering the amount of downloads on Spotify. But I thought that was good, and I would say that I've stopped listening to that. It's been a while since I've had to listen to the album, so maybe it had a shorter shelf life than something that I'm listening to years and years afterwards. But I did think it was really well done, and I did spend a lot of my year listening to that. Idols, Joy as an Act of Resistance is something I listened to quite a lot. I remember first hearing them on Six Music, and my initial reaction was that it reminded me of the white supremacist band in American History X that the guy's listening to in his van. And not from a lyrical perspective, because all their lyrics are very much about they are very liberal in their beliefs, and but just in terms of the tempo and the kind of the rawness and heaviness of the music. And it's not the kind of music that I've listened to in quite a while. I mean, I'd probably say this is more the kind of thing I used to listen to in my teenage years. But it is just, it really grabbed me. I mean, my best way of describing it is it feels like a mix of the Sex Pistols and Iggy Pop. And Iggy Pop just in terms of the lyric structure, and in terms of it being simple in lots of ways, in terms of there's not lots to the lyrics, but very well thought out and very smart and clever, and touching on lots of different issues, whether that be around poverty, or whether that be around drug use or immigration, or like the lead singer had him and his partner had a stillborn, and one of the songs is about that, and it's just like incredibly moving. And so they have been someone or a band who has been on heavy rotation for a while. I watched them from the comfort of my own home at Glastonbury, and they are pretty powerful as a live band, and I think that's how a lot of their notoriety and they've become big, because of just how good. Is notoriety a positive thing? Okay, whatever the positive for notoriety is, but just being so great as a live act, and as a live band, and so I would recommend checking them out. It's Idols as an act of resistance, a Joy as an act of resistance. In terms of, I listened to a lot of electronic music. I found a thing this year, and it's been going for a while, but it's called Circle, but Cercle, and this is on YouTube, and they basically will do a set, whether that be a DJ set or a live set with a particular artist, but in the most incredible settings. So they will find some castle in the outskirts of some little village in France, and then we'll have like a party on the castle, and then film the whole thing. And they then just have lots of cameramen and women, and there's drones filming it all, and then it's just all edited together and creates a hour 20, 90 minute set, something like that. And I just normally put it on. I'm not watching the visuals, but have just listened to those, to many of them a lot this year. The ones that I've listened to the most is Fetals. I think they were the ones that I found first, and then Dominic Uhlberg. Both of them I've had just on repeat for many months, and so that's at the more electronic end of the spectrum. That's definitely what's been filling that bucket. And then more recently, in the last couple of months, I've got back into listening to Radiohead. So Radiohead's been favorite band since I was, 12, 13, 14, somewhere around there, and have just continued to listen to them over the decades. And for the last couple of years, just haven't listened as much. I'd have periods where I did, and then I'd stop. And then we went away to where did we go? Dorset. I think it was Dorset. Yeah, went on like a late summer holiday down to Dorset, and just started listening to them as part of the drive and when driving around, and then just got into a habit and just put all of their albums just on all the time. I must have listened to In Rainbows, I don't know how many times, but really started listening to that a lot. And then I discovered, and this must have happened when Ramsey was born or around that time, and so it somehow passed me by. They released a special edition of OK Computer as part of the 20-year anniversary, and then released a second disc as part of that. And so it was only more recently that I discovered that and just started listening to that over and over again, and that was really a really good find, because it was songs that they'd written around the Pablo Honey, the Benz time, and that's like a lot of the Radiohead that I like, although I like it all through the various albums. But I've just been listening to that a lot on repeat. Tom York, who is lead singer of Radiohead, released Anima this year. Is it Anima? God, I'm feeling like that's a Tool album from years ago, but I think it might be the same name. But he released his own solo album with, is it Paul Thomas Anderson is the film director who did like There Will Be Blood and The Master and other films. So he directed it, and they made like a whole short film for that album. So I've been listening to that a bit. And then Tom York did a song for the Motherless Brooklyn soundtrack called Daily Battles, which is amazing. And so that's been listened to a lot. So this last quarter of the year has been a lot of Radiohead going on my Spotify. And so that is kind of it in terms of music and podcasts and movies and books, and what has been doing it for me for this year, or for 2019. As I said at the top, if you have your thoughts on different things that you've been enjoying, then please send it over. Either comment where you can comment, or send an email to info@7health.com. I would love to find out. As I mentioned as well at the top of the show, 7 Health is again taking on new clients. So if you're interested in working together or finding out more, you can head over to www.7-health.com/help. That is it for this week. I'll be back next week. There will be another guest interview coming out. Until then, take care of yourself, and I will catch you then.
Thanks for listening to Real Health Radio. If you are interested in more details, you can find them at the 7 Health website. That's www.7health.com.